What could possibly compel a 17-year-old peasant girl who had never left her village or held a sword to convince the crown prince of France that she had been divinely commissioned to drive out an occupying army and crown him king? The answer lies in a story so extraordinary that it challenges everything we think we know about the limitations of youth, gender, and social position in the face of absolute conviction. The rhythmic sound of her mother's spinning wheel filled the modest cottage in Domremy as young Jeanne d'Arc went about her daily chores, her mind occupied with the simple concerns of rural life in the early 15th century. Born around 1412 to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, she grew up in a world where peasant girls were expected to tend livestock, help with harvests, and eventually marry within their station. Yet even as a child, Jeanne displayed an unusual intensity in her prayers and an almost mystical devotion to the saints, spending long hours in the village church when other children played in the fields. The France of her youth was a nation torn apart by the 100 Years' War, with English forces occupying much of the territory while rival French factions fought for control of the throne. Domremy itself lay in a contested region where loyalties shifted with the fortunes of war, and Jeanne witnessed firsthand the devastation that foreign occupation brought to her people. The suffering she observed planted seeds of righteous anger that would eventually blossom into something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The visions began when she was 13, appearing first as flashes of brilliant light accompanied by voices that she came to recognize as Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. At first, these supernatural encounters offered general guidance about living a godly life, but gradually they became more specific, more urgent, and infinitely more dangerous. The saints, she claimed, had chosen her for a mission that seemed impossibly beyond her capabilities. She was to save France, drive out the English invaders, and see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king. For 3 years, Jeanne kept these revelations largely to herself, wrestling with their implications while continuing to fulfill her duties as a peasant daughter. But the voices grew more insistent, especially after a series of military disasters that left French resistance at its lowest ebb. The English were besieging Orleans, the last major stronghold blocking their path to complete conquest, while the uncrowned Dauphin cowered in his court, seemingly resigned to defeat. The transformation from visionary peasant to military leader began when Jeanne finally found the courage to act on her divine instructions. In 1429, she convinced her uncle to take her to the nearby garrison of Vaucouleurs, where she demanded to speak with the captain, Robert de Baudricourt. Her request was audacious beyond belief. She wanted an escort to the royal court so she could convince the Dauphin to give her an army to lift the siege of Orleans. Baudricourt's initial reaction was predictable. He told her uncle to take the girl home and give her a sound beating. But Jeanne possessed a quality that transcended her humble origins, an absolute, unshakable conviction that communicated itself to everyone she encountered. When she returned weeks later, still insisting on her divine mission, something in her manner had changed. She spoke with such authority about military matters she should never have known, and with such detailed knowledge of recent French defeats that hardened soldiers began to take her seriously. Her breakthrough came when she made specific predictions about French military disasters that proved accurate, demonstrating knowledge that a peasant girl from Domremy could not possibly have possessed through natural means. When news arrived confirming her prophecies, Baudricourt finally agreed to provide her with an escort to the royal court at Chinon, though he probably expected the Dauphin's advisors to quickly expose her as a fraud or fanatic. The journey to Chinon required traveling through enemy territory for 11 days, a dangerous undertaking that would have challenged experienced soldiers. Yet this teenage girl who had never been more than a few miles from home navigated the route as if guided by invisible hands, avoiding English patrols and arriving safely at the royal court with her credibility enhanced by the very boldness of her journey. What happened next has puzzled historians for 6 centuries. Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin, was a weak and indecisive man who had been so discouraged by military defeats that he was considering fleeing France entirely. Yet when this peasant girl was brought before him, after he had attempted to test her by hiding among his courtiers, she not only identified him immediately, but spoke to him privately about matters that convinced him of her divine mission. The contents of their private conversation remain unknown, but its effects were immediate and dramatic. Charles ordered that Jean be given armor, weapons, and a small military force, despite the protests of his advisors who considered the entire enterprise either blasphemous or insane. The girl who had never worn armor or ridden a war horse was transformed almost overnight into a military commander preparing to face the most professional army in Europe. Her arrival at the besieged city of Orleans created an electrifying effect on French morale. The defenders, who had been slowly losing hope after months of siege, suddenly found themselves inspired by this unlikely figure who proclaimed that God would give them victory. Jean's military strategy was as unconventional as everything else about her. She favored direct frontal assaults over the cautious maneuvering preferred by professional commanders, trusting that divine favor would compensate for tactical disadvantages. The lifting of the siege of Orleans in just 4 days stunned both sides. The English, who had considered the city's fall inevitable, found themselves retreating in confusion before a revitalized French force led by a teenage girl carrying a white banner emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary. The psychological impact was enormous. If a peasant girl could defeat England's finest soldiers, then perhaps God truly was fighting for France. Victory followed victory as Jean's reputation for invincibility spread throughout the region. English garrisons that had held their positions for years suddenly found themselves abandoned as their commanders lost confidence in their ability to resist what seemed like supernatural intervention. French towns that had submitted to English rule began expelling their occupiers and declaring for the Dauphin, creating a momentum that transformed the entire character of the war. The campaign reached its climax with Charles's coronation at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site where French kings received their sacred anointing. Jean had accomplished exactly what her voices had commanded. She had seen the Dauphin crowned as the legitimate king of France. Standing beside the newly crowned Charles VII in her armor, holding her banner, she had risen further in 2 months than most people could expect to rise in a lifetime. Yet success contained the seeds of its own destruction. Having achieved her primary mission, Jean found her supernatural guidance becoming less clear and her military fortune beginning to turn. Her capture at Compiègne in 1430 by Burgundian allies of the English marked the beginning of the end, though she had no way of knowing that her greatest trial still lay ahead. The English, desperate to discredit the girl who had shattered their plans for conquering France, orchestrated a show trial designed to prove that her victories had been achieved through witchcraft rather than divine intervention. If they could convince the world that Jean was a heretic and sorceress, they could restore their own credibility while undermining French morale. The trial that followed revealed both the best and worst of medieval justice. Jean, despite her youth and lack of education, defended herself with remarkable skill against trained theologians and lawyers who were determined to find her guilty of heresy. Her responses to their questions demonstrated not only her quick wit, but her profound theological understanding, as she consistently outmaneuvered attempts to trick her into condemning herself. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her either in presumption or despair, she replied with wisdom that impressed even her enemies. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Her refusal to deny her visions, even under threat of death, revealed a courage that transcended physical bravery to touch something eternal and unshakable. The verdict was predetermined, but the process took months as her judges struggled to find legal justification for executing someone whose only crime was claiming to serve God in France. Finally, they condemned her for wearing men's clothing and claiming direct divine revelation, charges that revealed more about their desperation than her guilt. On May 30th, 1431, 19-year-old Jeanne d'Arc was burned alive in the marketplace of Rouen, her ashes thrown into the Seine to prevent the collection of relics. Yet, even in death, she achieved a final victory over her enemies. Witnesses reported that her heart, somehow unconsumed by the flames, had to be thrown into the river separately, a detail that enhanced rather than diminished her reputation for sanctity. The irony of her execution became apparent within decades. The English, who had hoped to discredit her memory, instead created a martyr whose reputation grew stronger with each passing year. A rehabilitation trial in the 1450s officially overturned her conviction, declaring her innocent of all charges and recognizing her as a faithful daughter of the Church. In 1920, Nearly 5 centuries after her death, she was canonized as Saint Joan of Arc. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of her legacy lies not in her sainthood, but in what she represents about human potential. Here was someone who, by every measure of worldly probability, should have lived and died in obscurity. A peasant girl in a world dominated by men, a teenager in a society that revered age, a commoner in an era that worshipped aristocratic blood. Yet through the power of absolute conviction and divine calling, she shattered every limitation that society had placed upon her, proving that transformative leadership can emerge from the most unlikely sources when fueled by genuine purpose. Joan of Arc's life teaches us that our circumstances of birth, our age, our social position, none of these determine our capacity to change the world. What matters is not who the world says we are, but who God calls us to become, and whether we have the courage to answer that call regardless of how impossible it may seem.